Fire ran before the men could. It leapt from cane trash to boiling house thatch, snapped along dry fences and lit the night so brightly that the hills seemed to rise and fall like breathing things. Somewhere near the edge of a yard, a bell rang and rang, struck too hard, as if volume alone could bring order back. A white overseer staggered into the open with a pistol that misfired, the spark flashing uselessly in the dark. And then he was down, dragged by hands he could not see. Musket shots cracked from inside a storehouse as enslaved men fought each other for weapons, the smell of powder mixing with sugar and smoke. Horses screamed, panicked by firelight and unfamiliar hands. Doors were kicked in, not always knowing what lay behind them, only that delay meant capture or death. A woman ran with a child wrapped tight against her chest, slipping on ash and cane juice, not knowing where the road ended, because the road itself was burning. Orders were shouted and contradicted and lost as overseers fled, slaves hesitated, and militiamen arriving late fired at shadows. In the confusion, old hierarchies dissolved in seconds. Men who had never raised their voices spoke commands. Men who had issued them ran. This was not a riot that could be cowed by noise or a show of force. This was a chain snapping in several places at once. By dawn, St. Mary Parish would be unrecognizable, estates gutted, families scattered, the air thick with smoke and rumour. Jamaica would understand that it had been living on borrowed time. To see how the night burned, you have to rewind to the island that made such a night inevitable.
By the middle of the 18th century, Jamaica was the most valuable sugar colony in the British Atlantic, a machine designed to turn land and human bodies into profit, at a scale that startled even its owners. Sugar grew fast, cut deep, and demanded constant attention. It pulled capital in from London and Bristol, and pulled lives apart on the island. Many estates were owned by men who never set foot in Jamaica, absentee landlords who lived on advances, mortgages, and expectations of ever-increasing output. Their agents on the island felt the pressure directly. Overseers were judged by yields, not survival, and debt made mercy expensive. Mills ran day and night in crop time, crushing cane under rollers that took fingers with them if a hand slipped or a sleeve caught. Boiling houses were furnaces where syrup thickened into crystals under a watchful eye that allowed no rest, heat driving men to collapse and be hauled aside so the work could continue. The wealth was visible in Kingston's counting houses, and in the planters' great houses set above the fields. But so was the fear. Whites were outnumbered by the enslaved population by margins that made every rumour feel like a threat. In some parishes there were 10 enslaved people for every white inhabitant. Hurricanes could ruin a season, disease could wipe out a workforce, and news of revolts elsewhere in the Caribbean travelled fast. Jamaica's riches rested on a demographic knife edge, and everyone who profited from sugar knew it, even if they pretended otherwise.
The men and women who made that wealth possible had not come as blank slates. Many had been taken from West and Central Africa through wars that selected for fighters, not the compliant. Among them were people the British called Coromantee, largely from the Akan-speaking regions of the Gold Coast, with military traditions, systems of command, and an understanding of how to organise under pressure. British officials wrote of them with a mixture of fear and exaggeration, casting them as naturally violent, conspiratorial, and resistant to control. These stereotypes hardened policy.
Coromantee men were watched more closely, punished more harshly, and blamed first when anything went wrong. They arrived with scars that told stories, with memories of coordinated movement and signals, with an ear for drum language and coded speech. Plantation owners learned quickly that this population did not forget how to plan. Networks formed despite surveillance, crossing estate boundaries through market days, shared work gangs, family ties, and the long, dangerous walks taken at night between provision grounds. Messages moved by word and gesture, and by objects that meant one thing in daylight and another after dark. Slavery tried to reduce people to labor units, but it also concentrated skills and experiences in ways that made coordination possible, and fear sharpened attention rather than dulling it. Daily life on a Jamaican plantation left little room for illusion. The work was relentless and calibrated to exhaustion, organized around seasons that determined whether sleep was possible at all. At first light, the bell called people out to the fields, where cane knives rose and fell until shoulders burned and hands blistered. And in crop time, the work did not end with sunset. Drivers enforced pace with whips, and overseers measured output against quotas that took no account of sickness or injury. Women worked while pregnant, returned days after giving birth, and watched infants die at rates that shocked even seasoned observers. Punishment was public by design. Floggings at the post meant to instruct as much as to hurt. Iron collars that cut into flesh and marked the wearer as defiant. Time in stocks where insects finished what the whip began. Disease was constant. Yaws, dysentery and fevers moved through barracks built to hold bodies cheaply, not safely, and mortality outpaced births year after year. Food was never enough, dependent on provision grounds that could be raided or neglected when work ran long or storms struck. Death became ordinary, commented on briefly, and then absorbed into the rhythm of labour. Surveillance extended beyond daylight. Passes were demanded, patrols roamed, informers were cultivated with small favours and the promise of protection. In such a system, rebellion was not an abstract idea or a distant hope. It was a calculation, made repeatedly and quietly. It weighed the certainty of slow destruction against the risks of sudden violence, and found the latter rational. Into this pressure cooker came something the planters feared almost as much as numbers: obeah. It was not one thing, but many, a set of spiritual practices that bound people to each other and to forces that the enslavers could neither fully see nor control. Obeah worked on morale as much as on belief. It promised protection, demanded secrecy, and created lines of authority that did not run through the plantation hierarchy. An oath sworn before a charm carried consequences that did not depend on overseers or courts. A ritual could turn fear into resolve and hesitation into action. Stories of invulnerability spread, sometimes believed, sometimes strategically encouraged, and that belief alone could make men stand when they might otherwise run. Planters tried to outlaw it, to brand practitioners as criminals, to break its hold with exemplary punishment. But suppression failed repeatedly. The more obeah was targeted, the more it confirmed that the masters feared something they could not name. They understood that obeah undermined their most important weapon, the conviction that resistance was futile. The spark came in April 1760 in St. Mary Parish on the north coast, a region of plantations threaded by roads that led inland and outward to the sea. On the estate of Frontier,
During an Easter gathering that allowed enslaved people to move with less scrutiny, plans that had been laid in fragments snapped into place. Meetings that had seemed speculative became urgent. Signals were sent and read. A leader emerged who had learned war before he learned bondage, a man remembered as Tacky. Weapons were the first priority, because without them momentum would die quickly. Rebels seized muskets from a storehouse, overwhelmed guards before alarms could be raised, and moved fast to prevent news from travelling ahead of them. They killed some overseers immediately, knowing delay invited retaliation, and spared others long enough to extract information. Sugar works were targeted not just as symbols, but as assets. Burning them denied planters both profit and shelter, and forced decisions on the run. As word spread, groups from neighbouring estates joined in, swelling numbers and confidence, but also creating strain as leaders tried to coordinate people with different expectations and levels of commitment. Some whites were killed outright, others fled, carrying half-formed warnings to towns already primed for panic. The rebellion did not move as a single mass, but in coordinated bursts over days, striking where advantage lay, withdrawing before organised resistance could form, sometimes arriving to find that promised support had not materialised. The colonial response was immediate and chaotic, unfolding unevenly across the island. Militia units were called up, men who had drilled for such moments but had never faced an enemy that knew the terrain better than they did. Muster rolls were incomplete, arms were old, and powder was often damp. Guns were issued, powder rationed, and couriers sent to summon regular troops, many of whom were stationed far from the trouble spots. Emergency measures closed ports, restricted movement, and empowered magistrates to act without delay, often on rumour alone. Rumours outran facts. Reports of thousands under arms multiplied with each telling, while actual encounters were confused and contradictory. Estates fortified themselves with trenches and makeshift palisades, while families crowded into garrison towns that had neither the space nor the provisions to receive them. Food ran short, tempers frayed, and suspicion spread. The fear was not only of death, but of reversal, of a world turned upside down, in which the people who had been compelled to labour now decided who lived and who died, and where loyalty itself became suspect. Into this conflict stepped the Maroons, free communities of formerly enslaved people who had secured their autonomy decades earlier through treaties with the British. Their knowledge of the interior was unmatched, their fighting ability proven, and their political position fraught. Bound by agreements that promised land and freedom in exchange for policing runaways and assisting colonial authorities, Maroon leaders faced a choice that was never simple. Internal debates weighed obligation against memory, treaty promises against shared experience. To refuse aid risked retaliation and the erosion of hard-won independence, as well as the accusation that treaties were meaningless. To assist meant fighting people whose grievances they understood intimately and whose defeat would strengthen a system that still threatened them indirectly. In the end, Maroon trackers and fighters were deployed, their skills decisive in a war that turned on pursuit as much as on battle. They cut trails through bush the militia could not read, read signs others missed, and closed distances that rebels had relied on to stay ahead, altering the balance without resolving the moral tension at the heart of their involvement. The tide turned through a series of setbacks rather than a single defeat, as days of pressure replaced the initial shock. Surprise gave way to attrition, as patrols learned where to concentrate force and how to exploit informants. Leadership losses mattered deeply. Tacky himself was killed, shot during a confrontation that robbed the movement of a central figure at a critical moment, and sent a ripple of uncertainty through the ranks. Others were captured or betrayed under duress, their knowledge extracted and turned against their comrades, sometimes unwittingly. Supply became a problem as hiding places were compromised and food grew scarce, forcing choices between movement and exposure. Small bands were hunted down, their routes anticipated, their confidence shaken by the realization that invulnerability had limits, and that allies could be compelled to act against them. By late 1760, organized resistance had been broken, though scattered violence continued to flare, reminders that submission was not acceptance. What followed was terror, applied deliberately and methodically. Public executions were staged to teach lessons that the authorities wanted learned and remembered, with procedures designed to maximize visibility and fear. Bodies were displayed, heads set on poles at crossroads, gibbets erected in places chosen for traffic rather than convenience. Trials were swift, evidence thin, and mercy rare. New laws tightened control over movement, speech, and spiritual practice, embedding emergency measures into everyday governance. Obeah was targeted with renewed ferocity, its practitioners singled out as instigators regardless of proof. The island was reshaped not only by fear but by policy, as planters and officials sought to prevent a repetition of the night that had so nearly undone them. Yet the repression carried its own consequences, hardening divisions, encouraging secrecy, and confirming for many the truth that had led them to rise in the first place. Tacky's war did not end Jamaican resistance. It clarified it. The revolt exposed the contradictions at the heart of a society that depended on violence to function, and was terrified by the possibility that violence might be returned. It forced the colonial state to reveal its priorities and its vulnerabilities, and it left memories that did not fade with the rebuilding of mills or the planting of new cane. In the years that followed, Jamaica would be quieter in some ways and more watchful in others, its nights still heavy with the knowledge that order was maintained, not guaranteed. The island had burned once, and everyone who lived there understood that the embers remained, waiting for the right wind.